Hello and welcome to the Literary City with me, Ramji Chandran, and this is episode 73. My guest today is a titan of Indian history and a friend, the esteemed historian and scholar Ramachandra Guha. The reason we are here today is not Ram's extensive work on Gandhi nor his other history, but for his literature. For no matter how interesting or tedious a writer's subject might be, it has the potential to come alive in the narrative. And to be able to do this, one must have the craft of language. A famous writer once said, "I don't do anything. All the words are in the dictionary. I only string them together." Maybe that was in a movie. Anyway, clearly, some people string better than others. Today, in a refreshing departure from the norm of the typical interviews with Ram Guha, we discuss literature and prose, something that he captures in his latest book, The Cooking of Books, a slice-of-life memoir about his relationship with his first editor, if not entirely muse, Rukun Advani. My first encounter with Ram Guha's writing, and I have probably read every book that he has written, barring a few on cricket, was what could have been the start of his own intellectual odyssey, Savaging the Civilized. I was carrying a freshly purchased copy of it into our favorite cafe in Bangalore, Koshy's, and Ram jabbed approvingly at it. Savaging the Civilized is a book about the famous environmentalist and sociologist Elin, an Englishman who lived and worked amidst tribal folk in India. Ram Guha embodies a similar paradox. A Tamil born in Dehradun, raised across various corners of the country, is often mistaken for a Bengali for his last name and has written extensively in the English language. This identity is evident in his work, in his colonial critiques, in his insightful biographies of Gandhi and other prominent figures of recent Indian history, and in his commitment to environmental and social justice. Not the least, increasingly, his outspoken political self. So this conversation with Ram Guha is not about Gandhi or any other history or sociology or politics, but rather about his prodigious output in writing, books, columns in newspapers and publications, and what must constitute a lifetime of research and learning. And it begs the question, what drives him as a historian and a writer? Is it the solitary pursuit of knowledge, the quiet contemplation he once described as staring out the window with a blank piece of paper in front of him? This ethic is wonderfully captured in The Cooking of Books. The title itself hints at a profound collaboration about editing a manuscript, a process that he celebrates through his long-standing association with Rukun Advani. And now, the conversation with a guest I've always wanted to have on the podcast. So to that end, joining me from his home in our shared city, Bangalore, Ram Guha, welcome to the Literary City.
Thanks, Ramji.
You know, this is season 4 of the Literary City, and you finally wrote a book that fits, right?
And short enough to fit also, probably.
Yes, we do have an egg timer. Okay, to plunge right in, I'd like to start with the way you started, Elin. And I remember running into you at Koshy's, and I just bought the book from Premier Bookshop. And that was what, about 30 years ago?
1999 March, so almost exactly 25 years.
25 years. Kind of slips by, doesn't it?
Well, Koshy is still standing, fortunately.
Yeah, last refuge.
Sadly, Premier Bookshop is gone, but Koshy is still there, yeah.
And I'm a third generation patron of Koshy's. And Prem Koshy has been warned never to change a thing inside that restaurant.
Yeah.
You know the joke? In Koshy's, when you walk in, the leftists turn left.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's true, isn't it?
Correct.
So, to plunge in, Elin, he has been described as anthropologist, sociologist, Gandhian, and he was as much English as he was Indian. There's a parallel to you there, isn't there?
Yes, that it's, I suppose, hard to pigeonhole him. It's hard to pigeonhole me intellectually or in a literary sense. In terms of the influences on me, intellectual influences and cultural influences.
True.
Certainly I have not remotely had as exciting or interesting or controversial a personal life as him.
truly from a broad perspective. But to narrow it down, one of your books that I enjoyed reading a lot was The Last Liberal and Other Essays. And in that book, you describe yourself as this: I call myself an Aruan Indian. How else would you describe a Tamil whose family has been domiciled for 4 generations in Karnataka, but who was born in Dehradun, educated in Delhi and Calcutta, and who, from the sound of his name, could be taken for a Bengali? That kind of narrows down the definition of you, does it?
Yeah, I also go on to say there that a Nehruvian Indian is someone who thinks he or she is at home anywhere in India, but their enemies say that they are at home nowhere in India, that they are rootless and deracinated and so on. So yeah, I've been very lucky that I've lived in different parts of India. I've traveled to different states. Next month, I'm going to Mizoram, which is one of only 2 states I have not yet visited. Next week, I'm going to Kerala for probably the 20th time. So I think I, of course, have roots in Bangalore. I used to have roots in Dehradun. But I'm endlessly curious about the history, geography, the culture, the politics of this amazing and incredibly maddening country. So yes, I suppose so were many of us who grew up in that generation, and we, of course, sometimes are at odds with what's happening today. But that's fine. I mean, we carry on living our lives, doing our work, writing our books. In my case,
And some of that sentiment was captured in The Last Liberal. I'm particularly fond of the essay you wrote on the death of Rajaji. It was evocative, and I can see how his philosophy mirrored yours. But it also tells me that you don't necessarily feel a Vedic detachment to your work and writing, especially. Was Rajaji particularly iconic in this respect?
yeah, I mean, I have multiple icons who lived and worked in modern India. So, obviously Rajaji is one, but more important than Rajaji is Ambedkar, and then there's Nehru, there's Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, and of course, above them all, in my view, Gandhi and Tagore. And clearly, these people disagreed with one another. I mean, Rajaji was in many ways a visionary, but he was also a reactionary patriarch when it came to his attitudes toward women. But I've taken something from all of them. The kinds of Indian thinkers and ideologues I have a distaste for. They are on one side, and I will not name them today because that's for another occasion, and others from whom I can take certain things. But you mentioned Elvin. I think one parallel between Elvin and me, which is completely accidental. Well, there are two parallels really. The first is that both of us have written in different genres. Elvin wrote anthropology, he wrote folklore, he wrote essays, he wrote polemical pamphlets, he did anthologies, and I have also written different kinds of books. However, he tried to write fiction and spectacularly failed. And that's been a warning to me. So I've never attempted a novel. In this new book of mine, I talk about how my editor, Rukun Advani, urged me to write a novel, and I tried and then just tore up the pages. The other parallel between Elvin and myself is that though we do think we are scholars and our books are well researched and have new ideas and new information and new modes of analysis, um, we have been mostly outside the academy. I mean, I've been in and out. I've taught and then come out, and I think that's so in a sense living adjacent to the academy, outside the academy, frees you to experiment with different kinds of literary and scholarly forms, and I'm grateful for that. I mean, obviously, of course, it's partly been enabled by my wife, who's the independent professional own right. So that's and partly also by my writing a column in the press. Elvin also wrote a lot in the press, by the way. There was a Japanese scholar who compiled a bibliography of his writings, which extended over more than 45 pages. Minute type. So he must have written 300 or 400 essays in the press. I mean, I've written many more because and sometimes essays in the press um, are ephemeral. They don't last. But sometimes they capture a mood, and they're a mood. They capture something more more telling and immediate way than a book of 400 or 500 pages can. So I think I'm happy to write in different genres, except I know I'm incapable of writing fiction, and I'm glad I learned that quite early.
Well, fiction or otherwise, Verrier Elvin's work also included a lot of literary works. So, was this a facet of the times that good expression was the norm?
I think in his case, of course, he had a much more developed literary sensibility than I have. I'm somewhat more sociological and analytical, though I like also good prose. He studied literature and he read a great deal of poetry. And I neither study literature, I read some fiction, but very little poetry. I mean, most of my reading is history, biography, politics, political theory, and so on. But yes, I mean, I think expressing your ideas clearly, at the minimum clearly, and possibly elegantly, I think is important for me. And it was important for Elvin. And it should be important for any scholar who wishes to reach an audience beyond that of his fellow scholars.
Now, to persist with your book, The Last Liberal, clearly that book has stuck in my craw. There is an essay that you wrote in it, which is titled, Why South Asians Don't Write Good Biographies and Why They Should.
Yeah.
But you do.
Well, and now other younger people do. I mean, that essay again that book was published, I think, a year or two after my Elvin book. That essay was published.
That was a couple of decades ago.
Yeah. And that particular essay was published in the Times Literary Supplement in the year 2000.
Okay.
And now several younger scholars are writing biographies. And I myself have started a series called Indian Lives, which is being published from HarperCollins, where I'm curating biographies by younger historians. But at that stage, there was a diffidence and inhibition. And Indian scholars thought that spending 300 pages on a single individual was somehow, not worthwhile. So that, and as I argue in the book, I argue in the book that the hesitancies of Indian scholars in writing biographies, or scholars of India in writing biographies, was disappointing and even sad, because there's so many interesting and fascinating characters. There's so many interesting and fascinating characters this land has produced through the centuries, not just in the last 200 years of tumultuous change as we modernized, industrialized, urbanized, gone from being a colonized society to being an independent nation, and all the excitement and the conflict that has emerged, but also from our ancient past. The first book in my Indian Life series is a magnificent biography of Ashoka by the great Sri Lankan scholar Patrick Oliver, which gives a completely fresh light on Ashoka's life, his times, his reign, his politics, his ideas. The second book is on Sheikh Abdullah. The third book, which will be out next month, is on Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. So there's been such a range of fascinating characters India has produced. And the thing about biography is that for the general reader, it's the best way to approach history. For example, the book that has just appeared in my series, Indian Lives, is by the well-known historian of Kashmir, Chitralekha Jutsi, and it's a biography of Sheikh Abdullah. It's called Chitralekha Jutsi, and it's a biography of Sheikh Abdullah. Now, supposing the book had been called the political history of Kashmir in the modern period, it would have had like 300 readers. But she's called it Sheikh Abdullah, the Caged Lion of Kashmir. And it is a political history of Kashmir through this man's life and his career. It's also a history of the conflict between India and Pakistan, of the region as a whole, of princely states. So it's not just about this man. It's using this man to explore many wider themes. But through the prism of biography, history can unfold in much more interesting and attractive ways for the general reader. But 20 years ago, an academic would say, I will call my book The Political History of Modern Kashmir. But not use Sheikh Abdullah as the kind of entry point, because he is the most interesting and important figure in that history. So I'm glad that younger scholars, foreign scholars who work on India, are adopting the biographical method, because it's a very productive, creative form of reaching a much wider audience for scholars.
Isn't that funny? In a country that is quick to deify anyone who has done anything good.
Yes. Yeah, and I think the important touchstone of a scholarly work is that it doesn't deify.
Right.
It doesn't set out to debunk either, It provides a nuanced, multi-layered, multi-textured approach. Because all of us contain multitudes, and all the great men and women of history at feet of place. They made clay, they made mistakes. They had errors of judgment. Sometimes they had incredibly fulfilling and influential public lives, but hugely complicated personal lives, and all that must come out in a story. So I think that's, clearly one does not want to go um, the hagiographical route, but really critical, well-researched, critical studies of individuals who made an impact, but also narrating their lives against a wider historical landscape.
And speaking of biographies, but cycling back to you, let's talk about Gandhi. And he is he's a person obviously of great historical importance, but importantly one on whom many biographies have been written. But the defining biography of Gandhi is what you have done. Before you wrote those biographies, you wrote on many other subjects, and then you moved significantly to your writing about Gandhi. The question is, did your early work on Elin propel you in that direction? Was there a connection?
Yeah, there is a connection. The connection is not just on Elvin. So before Elvin, I wrote a book on forest protest movements in the Himalayas,
I remember.
focusing on the Chipko movement,
Chipko movement.
a movement that was led by Gandhians. So these were living Gandhians enacting Gandhi, what they thought were Gandhi's ideals in the forests and valleys and farms of what is now Uttarakhand. Then I moved to Elvin. Then I wrote a book on the social history of cricket, which focused on a family of Dalit cricketers who were inspired by Gandhi and whose journey was, kind of shaped by Gandhi. Then I wrote a history of independent India about Nehru and Patel and people again who had worked with Gandhi. So I thought I must settle my accounts with a man who's been shadowing me for so long.
Huh.
And regardless of the fact that there had been 500 or 5,000 books on Gandhi, I was, determined to, do this. And because I knew that there was lots of new material that these other biographers had not seen. They had really relied very heavily on the 97 volumes of Gandhi's own writings as brought together in his collected works. And I was going to look at letters to Gandhi, intelligence reports, newspaper accounts, all kinds of fugitive pamphlets, memoirs, to create a much, not just to write about Gandhi, but to write about Gandhi and his times, to write about Gandhi and his relationships, which meant his colleagues, his disciples, his rivals, his enemies, his wife, his children, and so on. And of course, there was a life in three continents. There's a life in India, there's a life in South Africa, and there's a life in London. And eventually it had to become 2 volumes. And actually, I'm happy that I did it in 2 volumes. And as we speak, the first volume, which is essentially Gujarat, London, and South Africa, it's called Gandhi Before India. That is the basis for a web series currently being shot in Gujarat and Bombay, and then in London.
Oh, cool.
In which Pratik Gandhi is playing Gandhi and Hansal Mehta is the director. And I'm going next week to see the shooting. I mean, I've never seen a film shooting. So
that sounds like fun.
I just go to see what's going on. So, which obviously, in converting a book into a film, there are certain compromises you may have to make. You can't tell everything. You have to simplify the narrative in a certain way. But I've seen the script and I've tried to give my inputs into it, and so that's the limitation of making a book into a film series or a single feature film or into a web series. The advantage is you can reach a wider audience.
True.
Because young people today, are they going to read 2,000 pages in print on Gandhi? So I'm glad I spent not just that time, but also that amount of space. That it was an elaborately sketched out biographical study of Gandhi in 2 volumes.
Well, I've read those 2,000 pages, but I'm not going to pass up watching that movie.
Yeah.
This brings me to my next question. As a biographer, you look into other people's lives, but what's the life of a historian? Is it being quietly contemplated, like you said?
So it is. So there are two aspects to the life of a historian. One is sitting in front of my computer composing what I'm writing.
Right.
Now, that is common to the historian and to the novelist and to the poet and to the essayist and to the playwright.
Yes, it is.
Any writer. So you're alone with your thoughts. In the old days, writing on a piece of paper, then migrating to a typewriter, now, on a silent screen. But there's the other aspect to the life of a historian, which is not shared by playwrights, novelists, poets, polemicists, etc. And this is doing original research in the archives. So a historian, a biographer, a historian is what one commentator called an artist under oath. He can't make up things. So it means, and he must have new things to inform you about. It can't just be stuff you can get on Wikipedia or in Encyclopedia Britannica or in a published book. So one aspect of my life for the last, 40 odd years since I started my doctoral research was research in the archives, which means, shall we say, going to an archive, say, for example, the Gandhi papers in Delhi. There's a huge new collection that was opened just before I started my work. And these are indexed. So there are about 800 files, and they'll have different titles. So it'll say Gandhi's trip to Noakhali, 1946. You order that file, and it's 300-400 pages, and you start taking notes. Then you'll say letters to Gandhi by Jawaharlal Nehru, or letters to Gandhi from whatever Jinnah, and then you'll go to some other collection. Then you'll get a reference to some report of an attack on Gandhi's life, which actually happened. There were many attempts on Gandhi's life. One was in Pune in 1934. So, the course of your research, you get this report, and you don't want a second-hand account; you want a first-hand account. So, you go to an archive where you get the microfilms of old newspapers, shall we say the Times of India, the Bombay Chronicle, and see what their Pune correspondent said about that on the day in which they were attacked, and you take notes. So, one part of your life is, in my case, it would be 3 to 4 months of a year spent in different locations, in Delhi, in Ahmedabad, in Bombay, in London, in South Africa, maybe in an American archive, just sitting with files, documents, microfilms, taking notes. Again, it's solitary. That is solitary, but that is gathering the materials with which you want to build your narrative. And then you come back to Bangalore, and all my writing is done in Bangalore. I cannot write on the fly. I have friends who write on a long flight, or I can't do that. Who write in a guest house, in a hotel, on the beach, in a cafe. I can do none of that. I have to be in my study, from where I'm speaking to you now, writing. But so there are these two aspects, and I said one aspect is common to every writer. The other is peculiar to a historian. Now, what an anthropologist would do, what Elin would do, is that he would go out into the field. He would not go to the archive. He would, say, go to Orissa. If he was writing about a tribal in Orissa, he wrote about a book on the Swaras of upland Orissa, and stay with them for a few months. Talk to them about what crops they grew, what their festivals were, observe their style of clothing, relations between men and women, how they brought up their children, and then every night, usually in those days, by the light of a lantern, would note down all that he saw. Now, of course, he would have a recorder. An anthropologist would go with a phone and a recorder and record all of that. So the life of an anthropologist is less solitary, because she is speaking to people. Now, as it turned out, I was trained in social anthropology, but then I found I was not very good at interviewing people. I was not really good at getting stuff out of people. I was much more at home working with documents about dead people who did not answer back, shall we say. So that's less solitary. The life of an anthropologist is less solitary. A historian's life is really with documents in an archive, or in your study on your computer.
Right.
With, of course, seasoned by occasional trips to Koshy's or to watch a test match, and of course listen to music.
That's
and
so
good.
on. And now to your book. The reason we're here today is your book, The Cooking of Books, a literary memoir. It's all about the writing of books and the process of editing, etc.
Yeah.
It is a paean to your relationship with Rukun Advani.
Correct.
Could have been titled The Cooking of Ram Guha.
Possibly. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
The book is about writing and editing, and of course, there can be no editing without the writing, and there can be no writing without the competence to write and language. And the opening pages of your book are all about how well spoken your fellow Stephanians were. And for our overseas listeners, St. Stephen's College was one of the premier colleges in India.
Right.
And during this time, being well spoken was a matter of peer pressure, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, the first few pages, not the preface, but the first chapter, which is about the college in which Rukun and Advani both studied at the same time, had to be there because that was how we first got to know about each other. However, it's probably the most, you could say, niche, inward, even parochial part of the book, because it's about an institution, one particular institution in Delhi, which may not be representative indeed of university education in India, let alone the world. And it's also 50 years ago, so it's a rather distant time. But that was the world that shaped us. And then, of course, we moved on to different things, and then our careers intersected. Uh, but yes, I mean, it's there that both of us learn to write and think and, I suppose, to argue.
The book captures that sense of introspection in a very interesting way, particularly those passages where you speak about your early interest in cricket, and then you talk about your early interactions with Rukun Advani, where he looked down his nose at you because rather than being an intellectual, he thought of you as a mere cricket player.
Right.
And then it captures that process by which you became a person of intellectual pursuit and everything that defines your career from then on. Now, during the time, one of the texts that occupied your attention was Subaltern Studies, and I quote from page 117. Whereas Subaltern Studies Mark I was history as craft, Subaltern Studies Mark II was, I said merely, writing desk history, the conceit that relations of power can be read off as printed text. Could you break that down, particularly for my overseas listeners?
Yeah. So subaltern, I'll explain it, particularly for those listeners who are not familiar with subaltern studies. Subaltern studies was a movement of historians of India, not all of whom were Indian by nationality. In fact, among the founders of the school were two very fine British scholars who have been erased out of recent history of subaltern studies simply because they are white, and it's not fashionable to say white people can do good things nowadays. So they were historians. Subaltern studies was a movement of historians of India arguing that the history of Indian nationalism had been one of elites, Gandhi, Nehru, etc. And they were going to write about ordinary folks, peasants, workers, tribals, and their struggles, which they did quite successfully and insightfully in a series of books and articles. Now, that is what I call in this book, Subaltern Studies Mark I. However, later on, they moved to what was called post-structural analysis, looking at inspired by the late Edward Said, who was a literary scholar, who looked at texts, who looked at printed books, and tried to analyze those printed books for what he thought were the prejudices of the writers, And that's what subaltern studies then did. So from going into the field, going into the archive, examining court records, trying to study how peasants and tribals and workers lived, thought, related, behaved, struggled. They then moved to looking at texts by white men and imitating Edward Said. They weren't even good imitators of Edward Said. Edward Said was clever at what he did and adroit at what he did. They just sort of said, this white man writing this book is an imperialist, he's arrogant, he's patronizing. And it was rather trivial in my view. Not that it was untrue, it was superficial and trivial. And it took away from the quality and the richness of their early work, which was about the lives of working class Indians, which had been ignored by previous scholarship, which only wrote about big, famous, powerful leaders. So that's really what it is. Writing desk history is you order a book from the library and you write a critical review of it.
Right.
A book in the 1850s, you say this white man did not understand India for ABCD reasons, rather than go out into the archive and see how Indians in the 1850s were living.
Right, yes.
And struggling, which is what they had once done. Yeah.
Well, at least, or maybe at most, Edward Said was on the correct side of Orientalism, wasn't he?
Yes, but he had his book is interesting but deeply flawed. And as I said, it produced a whole series of bad imitations, and that's often the fate of pioneers.
Right.
Karl Marx once famously said, "I am not a Marxist."
Yes, true.
Gandhi would have said, if he had looked at some of the Gandhians, would have said, "I am not a Gandhian." And possibly Ambedkar would have also said, "I am not an Ambedkarite." And the Saidians maybe did Said a disservice.
And you write that this bothered you. You write that they took a turn, and I paraphrase, from Marxist historiography to Jacques Derrida and that movement.
Yes. Yeah.
But in this book, rather than be all pedagogic about it, the following pages were hilarious.
Yeah, yeah. And Rukun Advani wrote a parody of all of that. He was, by the way, he was the editor of Subaltern Studies.
Right.
Subaltern Studies was published by Oxford University Press, and he was editing those books. And even I had even written for one of the early volumes. So we were both disenchanted. We were both involved with the project. He much more deeply than me, and we were both disenchanted by this linguistic turn it took. And then we both wrote our kind of mocking satires about it.
I laughed out loud, bringing conversation to a halt at the next table. Elsewhere in the book, there are descriptions of your journey from being a cricketer to becoming a scholar. When it happened, were you conscious of this?
Very much so, and I don't talk about it here, but I've talked about it elsewhere. I gave away my entire collection of cricket books. So it was kind of a repudiation of my past, like whatever. Yeah.
Yes, it's so true. I've heard of people who want to erase their past, so they give away their books. And I think it's rather appropriate to this discussion that we talk about the connection between oneself and one's books.
Yeah, very much.
And there are also descriptions in the book of how your editor, the person you write this book for, Rukun Advani, telling you that you must pay as much attention to the prose of the scholars you read as much as their substance. Specifically, it looked like he was trying to fashion you into being the sort of writer that kept away from what you describe as academic bombast.
Yes.
As an editor, did he red pencil a lot of your writing?
He did, and some examples are quoted in the book. Not of the, and of course, I mean, perhaps less in my case, in the case of some other writers who may have needed more assistance with their prose, because I was interested in good writing from an early age, and Rukun, of course, his inputs were often more intellectual and structural. How to approach a biography, how to write about the sociology of peasant protest, because he was not just a writer; he's also a scholar with a PhD from Cambridge. But he did clean up my prose, and I did, without doubt, become a better writer under his guidance. I think a better book writer and also a better prose writer.
Right. And I assume that language and expression were never your problems. So what specifically was it? Brevity?
And also, because I'd done a PhD and I was living with scholars, there was a subconscious influence of my peer group. So I had to escape that and get rid of that. And Rukun helped me make that transition.
And an associated thought over here that I've noticed is that quite a few people are very fluent in language when it comes to their professions, a matter of being functionally fluent. And I've noticed lawyers, accountants, techies are able to explain something in their craft or their trade or their profession in navigating the most complicated prose, but find it hard to just compose a normal letter.
I think partly it is obviously the internet and messaging, text messaging, where you use all kinds of abbreviations and emojis to communicate your emotions rather than spell it out in a clearly worded and grammatically correct sentence. So part of that is that too. And you read much less. You just surf the net. You read much less, yeah.
But having said that, you did receive a rather strange, backhanded compliment from, what was it, a professor of literary history?
Yeah.
Hilarious.
Yeah, that was, I had written an essay actually on Subaltern Studies, which he liked. And he recommended it to his students. And he met me in a library and said, I read your essay. And I've recommended it to my students. And I've told them, don't be confused by how well it is written. It is still saying important things.
That is hilarious.
Because by default, you would write clearly, you're not a scholar, you have to be obscure and, yes, mystifying to be saying important.
No doubt. I'm fond of saying that in India, we just don't take our humor seriously.
Yeah.
But let's talk about someone who knew what he was saying in writing, Nehru. You slipped in that extract from his speech.
I'm glad you noticed that. Yeah, I'm glad you noticed.
Not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially.
I'm glad you noticed that. Yeah. Thank you for noticing that. Yeah.
As promises go, what was this? Cynicism?
So it was realistic. He was a student of history. I mean, unlike our present politicians who promise the moon and say we're going to be the greatest nation. We already are the greatest nation in the
Oh,
world.
yes,
But
completely.
if not in 10 years, he was a student of history. He knew what had happened to the utopias that, this is 1947. So he had seen what had happened to the utopias that Hitler and Mussolini were constructing in their respective countries. And he traveled to those countries in the 30s, by the way. He knew something about Italy and Germany. So he said that as a student of history. I mean, he was realistic about what can be achieved and what cannot be achieved.
Now, there's a thought, realism in politics. But let's talk about Rukun Advani for a minute. I read his book, Beethoven Among Cows.
Yeah, yeah.
I found it a fascinating book, and what defines that book is humor, and the book is very funny. Now, this might seem like a bit of a stretch, but when writing about people, biographies, I mean, it's necessarily to speak of human foibles, because that's what is the composition of any human being. And there's always an underlying sense of humor about how one must approach the subject if one is not to become judgmental. And I find a lot of humor in your writing.
Yeah, and I think in Rukun's case, it's often irreverent humor. It's not gentle. My humor is usually more gentle, and this is more irreverent. So if you see contrast in the letters, he tends towards bitter and savage sarcasm, and mine's more self-deprecation. But yeah, humor of different kinds. Um, I think Khushwant Singh once said the Indians are not a humorous people, and I think he was dead right.
Yeah,
I think he was dead right. And
I remember his quote. It was, humor is dangerous in a hungry land.
well, we are no longer hungry, and we still find humor. Look at the attempts to ban, films and web series,
Oh,
and
true.
to delete tweets and all of that. So absolutely, we are no longer hungry, but we are still humorless. I mean, I think Indians are a humorless people. The British, I think, are in many ways a model for us. I mean, we are not supposed to learn anything from the British because they conquered us
Oh,
and so
no.
on.
Yeah.
But in terms of wit, or both of the satirical kind and the self-deprecatory kind, I think we have something to learn from the British.
I submit, and I feel that, in this is what I do in this podcast for a living, read books. And the books I read of late, I miss the humor in writing. It's all become so disconsolate. And I do have to read tons of books to interview people.
Correct.
It's what it is, I guess. All right, before I let you go, a couple of questions. One, been bothering me for a long time. We've always heard accounts of travelers who have come to India, like Alberoni, Marco Polo, and if so many people who have come and written about our history, interacting with society, kingdoms, and so on. Why aren't there enough records of Indian travelers who've gone overseas and written about their histories? Have there been any?
They were. So they were, and some historians have written about them. So the historian Muzaffar Alam and his colleague Sanjay Subramaniam have written books about Indian travelers in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. I mean, there were a few, but these scholars, Alam and Subramaniam, have found their diaries and their travelogues, have written about them. Unfortunately, those books are published by academic presses, and I wish these scholars would seek to write for a wider audience. But they're fine scholars who have actually discovered a previously little known but fairly rich vein of Indian travelers overseas. And there would have been similarly people who were going to Southeast Asia. And so obviously, they weren't as numerous, as well known, and as prolific in their writings as European travelers to the East. But they were not completely absent.
Finally, your journey. You were in your early 30s, mid 30s when you wrote Elvin.
It was published when I heard about Elvin when I was in my early 20s.
Huh.
And it's when I moved from economics to sociology after reading Elvin.
Right.
And I published my book on Elvin when I was in my early 40s. So for about 20 years,
I see.
Elvin was not the sole passion of my life, but one of the consuming passions of my life. I mean, I was fairly obsessed with Elvin for quite a long time.
And have these intervening years changed you any?
Well, I moved on to other subjects, but I'm grateful to Elvin for, easing my transition from cricket to scholarship, and also for giving me models of how to write for a wider audience, how to write engagingly, hopefully wittingly, and possibly even, if you have to write with sadness, empathy where required, sadness where necessary. So yes, I mean, Elvin was an important influence on me, for sure. And somewhere he'll always be there. Yeah. And I'm always very happy when people, I mean, it's been 25 years since the book has been published. And I published other books since that have sold much better. But I'm always very touched and moved when someone writes to me saying that they're reading the book, Savaging the Civilized, and even more touched and pleased when they say, "This is the best book you've written," because it meant so much to me because of what Elvin did to me personally.
That is a wonderful sentiment. And on that note, Ram Guha, thank you so much for being my guest today on The Literary City.
Thank you, Ramji. Thanks.
You have been listening to the esteemed historian Ramachandra Guha, author of the book The Cooking of Books, a literary memoir. Delightful read. There's a link in the podcast description to where you can get yourself a copy of that book. But of course, and always, check with your local bookstore, the one you support. Up next, What's That Word? Words and phrases we use all the time but never stop to think about. This is What's That Word, and she, my co-host.
Hello, my name is Praniti, but you can call me P. That's P with an A, not another E.
Hello yourself, P with an A. Talk to me.
I'm so happy we had Ram Guha on the show. What a wonderful conversation. You brought out a side of him that I don't think most people have seen.
Thank you. I had fun.
Clearly, but I could tell he did too.
I'd like to think.
Honestly, I'm very interested in history, but even without being very well read in it, I noticed that Ram's weighty books,
Right.
both in size and content,
Right.
they're written with a lightness.
Mhm.
I guess that's his literary skill. Would you agree?
Totally. And that's very well said. Well, okay, P with an A. What's that word?
History.
The word is history.
Yes, history. Say, what is more appropriate to discuss following an interview with Ram Guha?
I submit. So you want to know what is the history of history?
Yes, totes. We often discuss the history of the etymology. Today we discuss the etymology of history.
This gets worse by the second.
Okay, the etymology, please.
Okay, fine. What if I told you there's not much of a history in the etymology of history?
Are you trying to pull one of those labored Shakespearean attempts at puns?
Verily and forsooth, thou speakest as a pocket historian might, dear lass.
Pocket historian? Okay, I'll take pocket historian. But now, the etymology, please.
Okay, I warned you there wasn't much. All right, the word history came into the English language only in 1390. Now, this is from the meaning. The meaning is a relation of incident, story kind of thing. It's all very indeterminate. It's from ancient Greek, and it came to us via the old French historie, not histoire, historie, and from the Latin historia, which means a narrative account. But in ancient Greek, historia meant a learning or knowledge by inquiry, record, or narrative.
That's it?
That's it.
This is boring. But wait, what did they call it before?
You mean before 1390?
Yeah.
I understand a variety of things. Who knows, really? But in the time of Homer, not the guy from The Simpsons, the real one. Right? Histor was a judge, a witness, or a wise man.
So when was Shakespeare?
Late 16th, well, let's call it 1600.
Okay, so this was a few hundred years before him.
Yes, but interesting you ask. I looked up this very thing and I did a search across the complete works of Shakespeare. And I found that Shakespeare had used the word history a mere 15 times across his whole body of work.
Wow, that's it. But the guy wrote so much on history.
What was he thinking, right?
Let's blame this on Bacon.
Oh, you mean he didn't bring it home?
What? Oh, a pun.
I try.
Shakespeare punned a lot, didn't he?
Certainly did. And remember, the audience, Shakespeare's audience of his day, were a bunch of working class folks, not necessarily given to classical education, But they all got it clearly.
Yes, you can tell by the number of likes and shares.
Indeed. Those of the day, hieroglyphic memes.
And what's your favorite Shakespeare pun?
Okay, my favorite Shakespeare pun is very obscure. I do have one. It's very obscure. And only Shakespearean buffs, or Shakespearean bores, as our tribe is referred to, justifiably. It's from As You Like It, and it's spoken by the character Jacques in his famous speech known as the Seven Ages of Man speech.
Pray tell, good sir.
You asked for it. Okay, here goes. His youthful hose well saved, a world too wide for his shrunk shank, and his big manly voice, turning again towards childish treble pipes, and whistles in a sound. Last scene of all, that ends the strange eventful history. His second childishness, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything.
You're kidding me, right?
No, it's right there. You can look it up as you like it.
Is this full of innuendo? Youthful hose, shrunk shank?
Well, it depends on how you see it. If you just, for a minute, take your mind out of the gutter, hose is clothes, as in hosiery.
Okay, fair point. And what about shrunk shank? There, gotcha.
Yes, I'll admit. Shakespeare always made very naughty puns, his so-called purple patches. But this one also talks of a person who grows old as a sad side to it, right? Let's look at the meaning of it. It's a man who grows old and shrinks, so his clothes, his hose, become too loose for him as he gets old.
Such BS. I know what you frat boys are up to.
We frat boys? You mean me and Billy S?
Yes, I know you hang with him too much.
Another pun, wee lassie?
What? Oh no, I'm out of here, forsooth and forthwith. Bye.
And that is our show. Thank you so much for being here and for listening. I'd like to thank my guest Ramachandra Guha and my co-host Pranati P with an A Madhav. Now, stay tuned. We're going to be back with wonderful guests this season as fast as we can manage it. And until we meet again, stay dry, stay safe, have fun. I am Ramji Chandran and this is The Literary City.